the camera arts, photography and film. Before we get into our discussions on fine arts and the historical context of fine arts, we want to stop and look at the camera arts and graphic arts as well, because these are the arts of daily life, the things that you're coming into contact with all the time, and being able to discuss them, to analyze them, can help you to be a better consumer, perhaps improve a quality of life. Also, it'll give us a chance to practice our visual vocabulary and the variety of analytic approaches we've discussed. So we start with photography, which literally means to write with light. So images are made on photosensitive surfaces by light passing through a lens. The basic concept of photography had been with us for several hundred years before cameras as we know it existed. The basic concept was that of the camera obscura, which literally means dark room. So if you take a dark room, or let's say you take a shoebox, a darkened box, make it light tight so no light's getting in there, except for light passing through one small hole, the light of the outside world will be projected through that hole and project an image on the back side of the interior. Now, it won't necessarily be in focus. You might have to use various lenses to help you do that, but it does actually project through that hole. And in this case of the camera obscura in the mid-1600s, the artist could get inside via this little door at the bottom, be inside, and actually be able to trace that projection. The projection would be upside down when it first comes in. But they couldn't preserve it or fix it, as we say in photography, except through the artist actually tracing it. They adapted the camera obscura to a small tabletop size, inserting this mirror here so that the image would be flipped for the artist to trace. And people like Vermeer of the Baroque era might have used this kind of technology at the time. Eventually, we became aware of Helio Prints, or invented Helio Prints, and these are images made with direct contact with the sun. So a light-sensitive surface with some kind of masking, in this case, a leaf laid on top of the surface. And wherever the leaf is blocking the light, the page remains white. But wherever the light hits the surface, it actually darkens. Now the problem, though, too, is once you get a light-sensitive surface, how do you stop it? How do you stop the whole thing from turning black, right? Well, Daguerre was one of the first to discover this process. He realized that copper plates coated with silver iodide would capture the image, and they would have another chemical bath to stop the darkening. They are non-reproducible images, his daguerreotypes are. They reverse left to right. And the very first images actually required something like 8 hours. So this image up above actually required several hours of exposure time. And it looks as if it's an empty street, as if it's, a ghost town. But in fact, many people and horse-drawn carriages, etc., were crossing this street, but they moved too quickly for the camera to actually capture them on the image. The one figure that's captured is this man here who's stopping to have his shoes shined. Fairly soon, though, because there is an international conglomerate of inventors working on photography at the same time, they were fairly quickly able to reduce the time of exposure to about 10 to 20 minutes. Now that seems still incredibly long for us with our split-second camera phones, but at the time, getting it down to 10 to 20 minutes of exposure was miraculous. And really all of photography, if you can imagine living before it existed, where the only images you had of your family, of your friends, were hand-drawn or hand-painted images, we can realize that photography at its invention must have seemed like magic, to be able to have an image of your grandmother or great aunt or best friend, etc. For a long while, you still would have only taken images maybe once or twice in a lifetime. They weren't nearly the way that we take them all the time. But just being able to take images meant that for middle-class people, especially who maybe, and lower class, who maybe couldn't afford to have an oil portrait painted of them, they could have one image or two images taken to pass on to their loved ones. Fairly soon, even in the same year, 1839, William Henry Fox Talbot invents the negative, which is very revolutionary in that instead of just one image, like the daguerreotype, you could actually print the negative on a piece of glass, and then with that negative make multiples of the same photograph, right? And this is one image that Fox Talbot took early on. I think this is an interesting image in that it shows that, at least for this inventor, he was already aware of the kind of artistic possibilities with photography. I mean, he's not here documenting a person or something very practical, but it seems like he's aware of this as being a kind of an artistic composition. Portrait studios pop up fairly quickly in the mid-1800s. This is still before cameras are available to the public yet. That's not until really the 1880s and 90s. So for a while you would go to a portrait studio to have your portrait taken, or you might, in the wealthy classes, you might have a friend that was wealthy enough to have a camera and take pictures for you. Middle-class affordability was really important, and also just the idea that, yes, for posterity, even some things like calling cards, self-promotion. So think about the political arena before photography and then afterwards. So of course every political candidate wants you to feel like you can relate to them, and being able to produce their images and posters, etc., to advertise themselves was very important, as well as with any kind of celebrity. So show business would also have benefited greatly from this. As soon as cameras became a size that was portable, you have a few early artists and inventors taking these up into things like hot air balloons to get aerial views. And imagine if you didn't live where there were mountains, then you've never seen this view of your city before, right? It's a pretty radical change of understanding of your city, of your culture, when you get to see this aerial view of the whole map of layout. Additionally, places you'd only heard of in books or magazines or word of mouth, suddenly being able to see images of them must have been just breathtaking and really fueled people's imagination and their interest in travel and seeing far sights. Now, artists had mixed reactions to photography. Many of them were very afraid, in that it seemed like it was going to be taking business away from them, especially those who were portrait painters. Some landscape painters thought, well, if people can just take photographs, will they still want paintings and drawings? And while photography did take some business, I'm sure, yet still paintings and drawings are still very valued and actually kind of communicate different aspects than a photograph does. They were also concerned about the value and standards in art. So kind of the question, well, is photography too easy? If a machine's doing the work, is it really an art, or is it more of a craft? Is it too mechanized? But many artists were also very excited. They wanted to use the camera as a tool, that it could be a reference, they could reduce the sitting time. So instead of having your subject sit in front of you 8 hours, you could just take a photograph and paint from the photograph. Photography had a big influence on composition, so we have aerial views, snapshots, so more non-traditional and kind of nonchalant poses, and then cropping. So photographs seem to crop in a different way than traditional painting ever had before. So we see these changes. A lot of artists felt freedom from naturalism. So now they could do a portrait, but maybe they want to use unusual colors to show the emotion or the psychology of the person being depicted. And then, of course, many other artists saw it as freedom from any type of representation. So great, now we've got cameras, let the cameras cover the details, and we get to do these non-representational compositions of color, line, shape, etc. Anybody can do it. And then also wondering, so some people beginning to make the point that, no, photography is still an art. It's not just the machine, but that artists have to develop the images. They have to crop and select and edit, and that all requires skill and comprehension. Approaches to photography. Now, another question was whether photography was really a fine art or more of a craft. And those that argue that it was indeed a fine art, there were sort of two different approaches. Some, the first, thought that photography should just jump on where painting was, that they should take up all the historical tradition of painting. And so a lot of these artists wanted to do literary narratives, so mythological themes, other literary themes, biblical narratives, etc. And they were also interested in using a variety of special effects that we'll talk about. But there was a second school of thought, more of a modern point of view, and that was pure or straight photography. And these were artists that thought there should be, you should compose the image through the viewfinder. You should not edit or crop or use any special effects. So sort of what you captured was what you captured. Don't monkey with it afterwards. And these artists, these modernists, also really wanted to turn away from narrative, away from literary themes, away from spiritual themes, and focus on the modern world around them. So that's pure or straight photography. So an example of the first would be these. These are photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron on the first two images who wanted to jump on sort of with painting and do images like this, the winged Cupid here on the left, or an example on the subject of Ophelia from Hamlet, the play by Shakespeare. So using kind of this intentionally sort of smoky vignette type of format and these literary narrative themes. This bottom right gives us an example of a portrait actually taken by James Van der Zee of a young married couple. But if you look at the bottom left of the image, you see sort of almost like a see-through little girl. And here he's used a special effect of layering an extra negative in there, but trying to get this kind of ghostly effect, so that she is supposed to be a foreshadowing of their future, that their hope for building a family as they grow. So that's an example of an early kind of special effect that was possible. Now we can contrast that with these examples of straight or pure photography by Alfred Stieglitz and Charles Sheeler. And so they're trying to capture modern life without any type of narrative storyline. They're really interested in composition. So Sheeler gives us this great X in the foreground, these nice rectilinear and repetitious elements of the smokestacks, etc., and a great sense of kind of the industry of his era. And then on the right, Alfred Stieglitz in the steerage gives us this ship arriving into New York's harbor. And you can look at it just in terms of formal composition, and there's lots of nice diagonals leading you through the composition. But then also sociologically or historically, we're interested in who was coming in and seeing kind of the middle class above and then the lower class down in the steerage. Photos as fact. Now, even today, when we're all pretty aware that photos can be altered, we've probably all played around on Photoshop before, even knowing that, we still tend to look at photographs as having a different type of factual or documentarian point of view. And this was even more the case when it was a new genre. So people would look at images like these taken in the Civil War and not think that, or take them just as fact, and not be suspicious of the fact that actually Timothy O'Sullivan and others like Matthew Brady, they would sometimes actually move bodies on the battlefield in order to get across a certain point of view of the story that the image was going to illustrate. Or even early on images like this, where none of these figures were actually present together taking this image. Instead, Robinson had actually taken separate images of the different figures and then blended them together with his variety of film negatives. So, photography, when is more real, too real? When we look at photography, a few kind of ethical and moral questions are raised. Do we react differently to nudity or violence or other sensitive subject matter in photography than we do in painting, drawing, or sculpture? And is photography as a medium more apt to appear pornographic or offensive than other media? I think this is the question that is constantly being renegotiated in culture, and one that would be interesting for you to think through on your own. So how do you relate to nudity, violence, ideas of pornography, ethical questions in one media like photography versus painting or drawing? These are two images that were sort of on that borderline. Both of these photographers had some scandals related to them. Sally Mann took the image above, and she's a photographer who documents her family and her family life. And so a lot of her images, especially in the 80s and early 90s, were of her children. And her children happened to, in their home life, would run around naked or partially nude a lot of times. And so she would document that. But viewers don't necessarily know the situation and the context in which the pictures are taken. And so at times, some of her images, like this one above, have been seen as pornographic or at least exploitive of her children. And so there's been some question about that she's had to answer. Similarly, with the image on the right, this is a photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe, and you might recognize his name as being very tied to scandal. And certainly some of his images have been very intentionally dealing with sexuality, with sadomasochism, etc. But even this image here on the right of this little girl, Rosie, drew some controversy. She was the daughter of a family friend. He was spending time with her whole family, with her parents present, and she had taken off her underwear, I think, after an accident. And so it was a very natural, candid photograph. But possibly because of his name being connected with other scandals, many people were very concerned that this image had crossed a line. And I think it's a difficult question. I think both of these images are right on a borderline where a number of people would be very comfortable with them, and then some of us also would not be comfortable with them. So I think it's a question one has to ask themselves. Photojournalism is a way in which many of us interact with photography regularly. So we've seen in this image as some of the early Civil War photographs where the camera had become enough portable, not easily portable, but portable enough that photographers could take them out on the road. And so it really changed the idea of reporting. So changing from just facts and figures and text upon a page to being able to see these kind of images which bring home the realities of war or the realities of hunger and starvation during the Dust Bowl here on the right. Images bring those home in a different way. So by the 1930s, especially when we're looking at Dorothea Lange's work, the camera had become portable and even handheld, so not even necessarily having to have a tripod with you. You could take quicker images like snapshots, candid and spontaneous images, war and battle scenes, documenting victims of war and other social issues became really important. And we became aware that you could use photographs like this as a platform. So if you're needing to raise awareness about an issue, if you're needing to raise money, perhaps donations for some type of fund, or you're wanting to sway public opinion, that photographs can do that in a very unique way. They really can hit straight onto your emotions. And certainly images start to become iconic. So images like these from World War II and the Holocaust, that really so quickly changed the whole your whole emotion, your whole set of ideas so immediately. Or this one, it was very iconic for me from the Oklahoma City bombing, where I remember being in high school and seeing this image, and even still it brings back not just the facts of the event, but the whole kind of context and emotional quality around it. And so for you, they're probably already iconic images. And I don't mean to infer that they're necessarily all tragic ones like the last few that we've looked at here. Certainly there might be some iconic images of maybe celebrities that you're interested in, or different social and political events. But it'd be interesting for you to reflect for a moment on what some of those iconic images are that really take you back to that time and place. We're going to move on now straight into film, because it's a very natural progression from the advent of photography into film, that inventors and artists recognized that with sequential photographs, one could imply a sense of movement. So Edmund Muybridge was one of the first to investigate what he called animal locomotion and even human locomotion, and he would stagger cameras around a racetrack or across a floor in order to watch animals and humans move in front of them and trying to document that movement. This series of images that he took of a racehorse were some of the first that showed us that, in fact, there are moments when a racehorse has all 4 feet off the ground at once. And this settled a substantial bet in his day. Also, studies of the human movement. And then inventors around the world trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we make this an unbroken sequence of film? And from Thomas Edison's studio, we have Fred Ott's Sneeze, one of the first films ever made. It is just a few seconds of footage of apparently what was a very humorous sneeze that Fred Ott was able to perform. But Thomas Edison didn't have a projector that worked reliably or worked very well, and it was actually a French pair of brothers, the Lumiere brothers, who discovered and were able to create the first projector. And so in 1895 they had their first screening, and it wasn't anything like a narrative or nothing near a feature-length film. It was instead very small snippets of excerpts from daily life, and yet it was so new and magical at the time that the story goes, anyway, that people who were seeing this particular film footage of this train arriving at a station thought that the locomotion was actually like erupting out of the wall, and people were reported to have like screamed and run from this image. Before sound becomes available, we have the popularity of silent movies. And we don't even have movie theaters at this point, right? Because it's so new. So they're showing these in auditoriums or at theater stages. And often you would have live music, so you'd have a pianist or perhaps a whole band or orchestra accompanying them, or in other cases, at least a record accompanying the silent movies. And then we see an expansion of film into more narrative formats and feature-length films. And one of the first big-budget movies, at least of its time, was this one by D.W. Griffiths called Birth of a Nation. Now, unfortunately, the storyline is about segregation and is very prejudiced storyline. However, in terms of its form and format of the day, it really was revolutionary. The idea that you could make a feature-length image that you could use a variety of ways of cropping in. So originally, cameramen would sort of sit in the audience and the actors would perform as if performing a play, and the camera would sit still the entire time, which sounds a little bit boring for a film. But then they realized that, of course, the camera can move in different ways than an audience member can, and so we can get long shots like here where you can see the whole environment, or a little bit closer in where you're seeing a little bit more of the action. Or D.W. Griffiths was great at realizing you could also get medium shots and cropping in to get close-ups. And he actually even was one of the first to put a camera on a cart so that it could move, like the camera itself could move across a field of soldiers, etc. So he really reinvented how the camera could move and how the story could be told and then edited together. So a couple of these terms that we want to be familiar with, because you are going to be doing a film review. So originally, like we said, film was borrowing from the theater, but then it realized it had more options than theater does. And so when you hear the term shot, it just means an unbroken sequence of film. An unbroken sequence of film. A medium shot is generally from the waist up, if we're talking about human subject matter, so generally the waist up. A close-up would be head and shoulders. Extreme close-up would be just capturing part of the face, or an extreme close-up on a hand or something where you can't see the full shape of it. Long shot is a more distant shot, so you're able to see the full body and some of the context around them. So that's a better shot to use if you want to give an environmental context. Pan shot moves from left to right or right to left, so that the camera is moving. Whereas cross-cutting is about editing images from two different sequences. So perhaps it could be the heroine in the tower and the hero on his way to save her. And they splice back and forth from these two sequences, cross-cutting it together, which helps to build a lot of climax, sort of a lot of build-up and excitement. And then flashbacks you're familiar with, where they take us out of the chronological sequence back to an earlier point. So here's a couple examples. This image from Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind is a good example of a full shot, where we've got the whole body so we can see their posture as well as still seeing their facial expression, hand gestures, but you get just a little bit of context here, and so seeing them poised so closely to this cracked ice gives you a sense of their doomed relationship. A long shot here giving us a little more context around the figure, and this image from Big Fish. And also from Big Fish, a medium shot, where now we get a little bit more specificity of the facial expression, the hands. We're also looking from underneath him, so we're looking up, which in some cases can make us as the viewer feel intimidated by the person being shown. In this case, they're helping us look up because they want us to see the car stuck in the tree, right, in this fantastic movie. Of course, extreme close-ups, so really zooming in on part of a face or just part of any form. And then another aspect would be a montage. So this is when you are editing together pieces from the same scene, so not cross-cutting from different scenes, but a montage of pieces from the same scene, but from different points of view. And one of the famous first examples was from Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin from 1925, where soldiers are marching down this enormous set of steps and killing people in their path, and so we get the long shot here that gives us the whole scenario, the close-up here that gives us an individual emotional relationship, and then an extreme close-up here where we just see part of the soldiers and get a sense of their mechanistic marching down the stairs and just plowing over the people in front of them. So an interesting use of montage, which also builds kind of climatic emotion. So consider some of these things. What camera angles or composition would you use if you wanted to make someone appear heroic? Would you try to make them appear taller, maybe get down underneath? If you wanted to establish location, setting, or time of day, probably a more full or long shot, probably get some distance so you can see the space around. To make someone appear inferior, you might want to stand over them and look down on them, perhaps. And to make a character appear intimidating or frightening, you can also use lighting, etc. Okay, so consider these things as you turn toward your assignment. Choose a film, preferably one that you have not seen before. Watch it once through just leisurely, like you would any other movie. But then watch it a second time. And during the second time, actually pause to take notes. Skip 2 or 3 compositions. And in a 2-page response, write a formal analysis noting how the visual elements, principles of design, and specific shots were used to create meaning in the film. Start with a broad overview, then give a detailed description of at least 2 particular scenes that were noteworthy. Be sure to include photos of your sketches with your online essay, and if you use other sources, be sure to include a bibliography with your essay. Now, you don't have to like the film. It is okay to have a critical response. And I know some people like to watch terrible movies because it's funny and like to kind of be critical. So that is fine too. I just want to see that you're able to analyze whether your overall opinion is positive or negative toward that film. All right, thank you guys. Enjoy.